Magdalene, Peter and John encountered the empty tomb. Early on the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb and saw that the stone had been removed from the entrance. So she came running to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one Jesus loved, and said, "They've taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we don't know where they put him." So Peter and the other disciple started for the tomb. Both were running, but the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. He bent over and looked in at the strips of linen lying there, but did not go in. Then Simon Peter came along behind him and went straight into the tomb. He saw the strips of linen lying there, as well as the cloth that had been wrapped around Jesus' head. The cloth was still lying in its place, separate from the linen. Finally, the other disciple, who had reached the tomb first, also went inside. He saw and believed, for they still had not understood from Scripture that Jesus had to rise from the dead. Then the disciples went back to where they were staying. And in Luke 24, Luke adds this little bit. It was Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary the mother of James, and the others with them, who told this to the apostles. But they didn't believe the women, because their words seemed to them like nonsense. Peter, however, got up and ran to the tomb. Bending over, he saw the strips of linen lying by themselves, and he went away, wondering to himself what had happened. And later, Jesus appears just to Thomas. Now, Thomas, also known as Didymus, one of the 12, was not with the disciples when Jesus came. So the other disciples told him, "We have seen the Lord." And he said to them, "Unless I see the nail marks in his hands, and put my finger where the nails were, and put my hand into his side, I will not believe." A week later, his disciples were in the house again, and Thomas was with them. Though the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." Then he said to Thomas, "Put your finger here. See my hands. Reach out your hand and put it into my side. Stop doubting and believe." Thomas said to him, "My Lord and my God." Then Jesus told him, "Because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed."
Right now, two of my children and their spouses are in a place called Costa Rica, Central America. They're on holiday there. And the reason they're on holiday there is because the four of them had a little business going, and they sold the business, and they decided to have one last holiday before they run out of money. And so that's what they did. And they asked the children, our two grandchildren, "What would you like to do on a special holiday?" And they said, "Costa Rica." Why? Because Costa Rica is full of animals, birds and lizards and all sorts of things like that. And my two kids are into animals and lizards and birds and fish in a big way. So that's where they were. And last Sunday, we got a video from them on WhatsApp. Free of charge on WhatsApp, so you can send videos or photographs all over the place. It doesn't matter. And it was of the two children just after they'd arrived at their flat or their apartment in Costa Rica in the middle of the jungle, with the distance seeing the sea. And the two children were doing two different things, or experiencing things differently. Because Fern was looking upwards into the trees, looking for monkeys and looking for sloths, however you pronounce it. And she was looking because she wanted to photograph them. All through the years she'd been saving up her pocket money and bought a lovely camera, and she wanted to photograph them so that she could then paint them and draw them, because she's quite a good little artist. Louis, on the other hand, was looking down, and he couldn't wait to get off the balcony onto the ground, because he was wanting to find and capture some animals and look at them and study them and see what they felt like and see what they made a noise like. You see, he's the one that sort of wants to do things. He's not the one to sit down and sort of reflect on something. He wants to be out there holding something. Within 5 minutes of that, he had caught a gecko and was holding it and looking at it, having a whale of a time. But you see, the two of them were so different, and both of them looked at the same set of data, if you like, and looked at it completely different ways and came to completely different conclusions about what they were seeing. And you know, we're all like that, aren't we? We all approach the same sets of information differently. We respond to the same sets of information, and we draw conclusions based upon what we see, what we hear, and we take away different things from those things. Well, in the New Testament, we come across different characters who all experience the same experience, the empty tomb, but came away with different conclusions about it. They all saw it, but saw different things, remembered different things, and responded in a way that was different for each other. First, it was Mary Magdalene. She was the woman, if you remember, whose life had been completely transformed by an encounter with Jesus. She'd been a naughty girl. She'd grown up and did some terrible things. She got mixed up in evil, and it controlled her life. And then she encountered Jesus. And she'd been a spiritual wreck. She'd allowed demons to possess her, ruined her life. And yet when she met Jesus, and he transformed her life by forgiving her and showing her that life could be different if he was in control, she was now filled with the love and forgiveness of God. Here was somebody who had tremendous love for the one who'd rescued her, who'd saved her, who'd transformed her life. And she was the one who was there present as Jesus hung on the cross. She watched his agony, she watched his torment, she watched him die. The one that she trusted, the one that she loved, the one who had made such a difference to her life. She stayed at the cross when most of the other disciples and followers of Jesus ran away in fear. If somebody would have loved Jesus to be alive, it was her, Mary Magdalene. But she couldn't understand what had happened when she reached the empty tomb, or she reached the tomb and found that it was empty. John tells us that she reached the tomb on Easter morning and found the stone had rolled away. Somebody had removed it. It didn't make sense to her. The empty tomb was there right in front of her. But it didn't occur to her that Jesus had risen from the dead. You see, bodies don't rise from the dead, do they? Particularly not a body that has been ripped with whips that had lead and bone embedded in them. Not a body that had been carrying a cross with that whipped body. Not a body that had been nailed to that cross with huge rusty nails. Not a body that had a spear thrust into its side. This body laid in a tomb with a stone rolled in front of it was dead. There was no doubt about it. Bodies don't rise from the dead. In her confusion, Mary ran away seeking help, and she was seeking answers. And she goes to the people that she trusted most. John tells us that she came running to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one Jesus loved, and said, "They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we don't know where they have put him." But John tells us that Mary went back to the tomb later on. And two angels appeared to her, according to Matthew, and tells us that they told Mary that Jesus had risen. But Mary still didn't grasp what they were saying. She stood weeping outside the tomb, and a man came behind her, and a voice behind her startled her. She turns and looks with bleary eyes full of tears. "Woman, why are you crying? Who are you looking for?" But still the truth of what had happened just a few hours earlier hadn't clicked in her mind. She assumed that the person speaking to her was the gardener, and simply asked in her sorrow, in her grief, where he'd taken the body of Jesus. But then one familiar word transformed her life. If you like, the penny dropped. "Mary," the voice said. And she recognized that voice that she'd heard so many times. It was Jesus. The tomb was empty, not because they had moved the body, somebody had stolen the body, but because he was alive. And she was the first to recognize that Jesus was alive. He'd risen from the dead. Mary Magdalene went to the disciples with the news, "I have seen the Lord." It didn't register at first. She saw the empty tomb. She heard the voice of the angels. She listened to the man behind her. But eventually, the penny dropped. But then there was Peter, that impetuous one, who only a few days earlier in the upper room had promised Jesus that he would lay down his life for Jesus. Everybody else might desert you, but I would never lay down. I would never do that. I would lay down my life for you. And you remember what Jesus said to that impetuous man? 3 days you're going to deny me. Wow. 3 days later, that's exactly what happened. We saw it out the back there, didn't we? Peter told us the story. Round that fire, and people asked him, "You were with Jesus, weren't you?" "I never was." "Yes, you were. You've got the same sort of accent as him." "No." "Yes, you were. You were with Jesus." "Not me." And then the cock began to crow, and he realized that Jesus had said it would happen. He made a rash promise. Now he had made some false statements. Now Jesus, I'll never deny you. And he did. And this impetuous Peter, who had heard Jesus say that he must suffer, must die, suddenly had to stop and think. The tomb is empty. What is it all about? Peter jumped up and ran to the tomb to look. Stooping, he peered in and he saw the empty linen wrappings. Then he went home again, wondering what had happened. No longer the impetuous man who spoke without engaging his brain. Now the one who needed to stop and think about what he'd seen. what he'd heard the women say. He needed to weigh things up in his mind before making a decision about what he had seen and what he had heard, and even what he remembered Jesus had said. Didn't Jesus say he would rise from the dead? What does it really mean? I've got some answers to bring. I've got to make a decision here. He needed to reflect not only upon what the women had told him, but upon the evidence before his eyes of the empty tomb and the folded grave clothes. This was not a time for making a rash judgment, but for serious thought. But then there was John, the one who wrote the gospel that holds his name, the one who had been with Jesus through his ministry and had watched him heal the sick, cure people who were blind, raise the dead, teach with authority. The one who, like Peter, had been with Jesus on that Mount of Transfiguration, where they saw Jesus in all his glory. He was the one who was with Jesus when Jesus was in Gethsemane, where Jesus prayed, look, do I have to go through this? Is there any way that I can escape what is about to happen to me? And he was the one with Jesus who fell asleep when he should have prayed. And he had watched Jesus carrying that cross. And he was the only one of the disciples that actually went along and saw what was happening. He too heard the message of Mary Magdalene that the tomb was empty. And together with Peter, he had run to that tomb. He had found the strips of cloth lying in that tomb. The body of Jesus looked as if, well, it wasn't there. It looked as if it had gone straight through those cloths. He plucked up courage and actually went inside the tomb. And in his own words, this is what he says. Then the disciple who had reached the tomb first also went in, and he saw and he believed. Mary was slow to catch on. She looked at the evidence. She heard the voice. All of the indicators were that Jesus had risen from the dead, but it took such a long time for the penny to drop. Peter needed time to think it through. What were the implications of this? If Jesus is not there, is he alive? If he's alive, then this changes everything. And life will never be the same if I commit to what I think has happened. John saw, and it says he believed straight away. But then there was Thomas. Thomas, the patron saint of skeptics of our age, the 21st century. The honest skeptic. You know, we live in an age, don't we, where we doubt almost everything. But at the same time, we believe almost everything as well, anything. People still believe that the earth is flat. They believe all sorts of nonsense. They worship stones. They worship inanimate objects, thinking they have power. People believe almost anything, and yet, when it comes to looking at certain things, totally sceptical. And here was Thomas, who was somebody who was not going to believe unless there was complete evidence about what had happened. He was a man who wanted data that could be put to the test, and he could then know that something was true or not. But he was also a man who doubted just about anything and really was a skeptic about life. We first meet him in John chapter 11, when he was with Jesus when the news came that Lazarus had died. And Jesus wanted to go to be with the family in Bethany. But the disciples reminded him that when he was in that area the last time, they had threatened to take him and capture him and kill him. And it was Thomas, the pessimistic skeptic, who came up and said to Jesus, the one who always saw the glass half empty rather than half full, he was the one who said this: let's go with him. Let's die with Jesus then. In other words, he's going to go back, he's going to be arrested and die. We might as well go with him and die with him as well. And then in John 14, we see that Jesus was there telling the disciples that he was about to die, but that he was going to be with the Father. And Jesus says to them, you know where I'm going. You can follow me because you know exactly where I'm going. And Thomas was the one who said, no, we don't, Lord. We've no idea where you're going. And so how can we know the way? He clearly hadn't understood what Jesus had been telling him, and he wasn't about to accept things without knowing all the facts. He was the one who was prepared to speak out and ask the blunt questions that often we're thinking but never ask. It's not surprising then that after the news from his friends that Jesus was alive, Thomas made the statement that he did. They told him, we've seen the Lord. But he replied, I won't believe it unless I see the nails, wounds in his hands, put my fingers into them, place my hand into the wounds in his side. For Thomas, you see, belief had to be backed by concrete evidence. He had to have absolute evidence that the one who claimed to have risen from the dead, or they claimed to have risen from the dead, was the same Jesus that he walked with, that he talked with, that he'd been with for the past 3 years. He was somebody who wanted data, who required facts that could be put to the test. If you know, it was a week later when Jesus appeared to the disciples the second time. The first time, Thomas wasn't with them. That's why he wouldn't believe. He wouldn't believe even his closest friends who he trusted and he knew only spoke the truth. He wanted the evidence. But the second time, when they were together, Thomas was with them. And Jesus appeared there with them. Jesus wasn't angry or offended at the fact that Thomas doubted. He's never offended by anyone who doubts his existence, who doubts whether the things that the Bible claims are true. He was disappointed probably with Thomas because he hadn't believed his closest friends, but wasn't fazed by it. Wasn't surprised because he knew what Thomas was like. And he knows what you're like. And he knows what I'm like. He knows how we respond when we hear to certain things. He knows how you respond at the moment when you're listening and hearing about Jesus, the fact that he rose from the dead. And he offered Thomas the evidence that he required. Put your fingers here. See my hands. Reach out and put your hands into my side. Stop doubting and believe. You see, Jesus gave Thomas the evidence that he required, and then he offered him a rebuke. Thomas didn't need to touch Jesus. See, for Thomas now, seeing was believing. He'd heard the witness of the other disciples that Jesus was alive, but now he had seen Jesus. He didn't need to touch his hands or put his hands in his side. He saw and he believed. Doubt confronted with evidence, supported by sight, transformed into a belief. And Thomas made one of the clearest statements about who Jesus was that you find in the Bible. Thomas looked straight at Jesus and he said, "My Lord and my God." See, the honest skeptic who refused to believe without concrete evidence went further than anyone would have expected by declaring that Jesus was not only alive, but that he was God, my Lord and my God. But Jesus gave him a rebuke. He blessed him, but he gave a rebuke. And it was this: you believe because you see. But more blessed are those who believe without seeing. And you know that includes every one of us here this morning. See, 4 characters facing the same empty tomb, but each responding in a way similar to many folk who are prepared to face the empty tomb today. Some, like Mary, will receive plenty of evidence. Some of you have been coming to this church for years. You've heard the scriptures, you've heard the testimony of people, often people who've been through the waters of baptism. You've read the scriptures, but you've never actually responded to it in a way of belief, by way of belief. But then something happens. It might be something that's said by a person in a service. Whatever it is, suddenly the penny drops. It is true. I need to do something about it. Mary had all of the evidence that she needed, but she didn't just make the connection about what it actually meant. But the penny finally dropped. Others are a bit like Peter. They look at the evidence, same evidence that Mary saw. They don't quite understand what it means, but they go away and think about it. And you know, that's such an important step for us. We need to think, and we need to, as Jesus said on several occasions, count the cost of what it means. Because to follow Jesus, to accept that Jesus is alive, demands that we follow him with total allegiance. It might mean, as it meant for Janet and I, going to India for several years, away from our family, because that's where God wants us to be. It might mean that we are called to do something, go somewhere, or be somebody, take on a job that we never expected, because Jesus demands allegiance to us. Peter was somebody who had to think it through. I've seen the evidence. What am I going to do about it? And that may be where you're at this morning. Someone like John, as soon as they hear the message, wow, that's true, I know it's true. I've looked at it, I've looked at the evidence, and I know it, I'm going to nail my colours to the mast. Some of you like that, have been like that. At some point in the past, there came a point when you said, yes, Jesus. And it might be that today is that day for you. I've never nailed my colours to the mast, but it's true. Jesus is alive. And Jesus is speaking to you perhaps directly this morning, saying, trust me, I was dead. I died that you might be forgiven, but I rose to give you new life. It makes sense because it sums me up that I'm a sinner. It makes sense that somebody who had no sin himself died in my place and he rose to give me new life. I'm going to nail my colours to the mast today. But then there are those like Thomas, honest skeptics who won't believe without evidence. For them, there has to be a rational and reasonable basis for that necessary step of faith. You see, when Jesus said, "You believe because you've seen me, blessed are those who believe without seeing me," he wasn't arguing for making a step of faith without evidence. He was arguing for making a step of faith without sight. And that's very different. Faith, you see, faith is not believing against the evidence or where there is no evidence. There's plenty of evidence. There's so much evidence for the resurrection of Jesus, but it demands that you look at it and study it and examine it. Thomas was somebody who needed evidence, and when he got it, he was quick to respond. Jesus is alive. But Jesus said, didn't he? Those who are more blessed are those who believe when they haven't seen. You may have come across a man called Frank Morrison, who wrote a book called Who Moved the Stone. He didn't intend to write that book. He intended to write a book that showed that the stone hadn't been removed and that Jesus hadn't risen from the dead, but something else had happened. He was a lawyer, and he wrote the book as a lawyer, looking at the evidence and studying it and then coming to a conclusion. He was hoping to show that all of us in church this morning were complete idiots of believing something that wasn't true. When he studied the evidence, it tells us that in the book, that he came to the conclusion that the only thing that could have happened was that Jesus rose from the dead. There's plenty of evidence, and one of those sets of evidence is in fact the Gospel of John itself. Do you remember at the end of John's Gospel, chapter 20 and verse 31, it says this: Jesus did many other miraculous signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book, but these are written, including the story about the resurrection, that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you may have life in his name. You see, when it comes to the Easter story, we're all called upon to make a choice. We're all called upon to believe it or reject it. And in a sense, there's no middle ground. I remember when Brenda and Janet were at college together, we had somebody came and spoke about the overcrowded fence. You know, people sitting on the fence. They can't make up their mind about Jesus. Well, in a sense, if you're sitting on the fence, you've made a decision not to follow Jesus. Really, there's no sitting on the fence. You either believe it or you don't. You either commit to what it means or you don't. I wonder what choice you've made today about Jesus, the empty tomb. But there's one last thing I want before we close. I have been here loads of people saying things like this. Well, I love to accept the teaching of Jesus. I love the Sermon on the Mount. I like the teaching of Jesus. But do you know what? Just knowing and accepting the teaching of Jesus never transforms anybody. It's only when you get to know Jesus and what he did on the cross, not know about him, but get to know him by nailing your colours to the mast, saying, I believe it's true, Christ is risen, he is risen indeed, and I want to follow him. Knowing the person of Jesus changes lives, not knowing the principles that he taught. And that's why Jesus said to Thomas, stop doubting and believe. So this morning, I wonder, are you like Mary? You've been presented with lots of information about Jesus, but you're a bit slow to cotton on. My prayer is that this morning, something that has been said will be that missing little piece in the jigsaw that will lead you to say, Teacher, Jesus is for me. Maybe that, like John, you've listened and you said, it does make sense. I know I'm a sinner. I know I need to be forgiven, and I believe that Jesus died to forgive me, and he rose to give me new life. I'm going to stake my colours to the north now. It may be that you're a bit like Peter, that you've heard this message, perhaps properly for the first time, and you need now to ponder and consider it. Don't leave it too long. Go away and consider it, and make a decision to follow Jesus. Or it may be that, like Thomas, you're still riddled with doubt and confusion, and you won't believe without evidence. Well, that's okay, for God doesn't expect blind faith at all. But he does expect that we look at the evidence, weigh it up, test the credibility of the witnesses, and then make a decision. C.S. Lewis, one of the world's most brilliant minds of last century, was an atheist. But reluctantly, he says, he changed his mind. Didn't want to become a Christian, but he set out to look at the evidence for the resurrection, because he came to the conclusion, as did St. Paul, that the resurrection is the most important central pivot or central tenet of the Christian belief. If the resurrection happened, it is the most important thing in history. If it didn't, then you're wasting your time, I'm wasting my time, and we might just go out, eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. But C.S. Lewis looked at the evidence and came to the conclusion that the evidence for the resurrection was irrefutable. You see, based on the evidence of the work of Christ on the cross, the truth of the resurrection, and the testimony of reliable witnesses, he came to the conclusion that Jesus was alive. There was no other explanation that satisfied him. Nothing was as compelling as the evidence that Jesus was alive. He found historical and logical evidence for the resurrection to be more compelling than the alternative explanations. I don't know where you're at this morning, but Jesus leaves us with the same challenge as he left with Thomas. Stop doubting and believe. And the challenge of Easter Day, 2026, is one of commitment. Jesus calls each one of us to commit our whole self to following and getting to know Jesus.